evening and or late morning, depending on where you are in the world. I'm Brach Jennings.
And I'm Peter Clark.
And this is another COVID-19 edition of Stumbling Block. Today, we have yet another special guest, and I am very pleased to welcome onto our show tonight Professor Dr. Volker Leppin, who is Professor for Church History with a Reformation and Middle Ages focus, Dean of the Evangelical Theology Faculty at Tübingen. Oh, and he happens to also be my secondary dissertation supervisor.
So thank you very much for introducing me and for the long list of titles.
The last one, of course, being the most challenging.
I assume.
And, yes, the church historian has to work with the systematician. This is always interesting. And
something, yeah.
Yes, interesting.
For both sides.
yes. But we had a church history lover on our show a couple of weeks ago, and so now we have yet another church historian. So I presume this will be another night of Peter and the guest tag teaming up against me.
Well, you know, I mean, by inheritance of family, I do come by church history a little naturally. It's what my father has his master's degree in. So. Oh,
great! Good tradition.
And you see, I'm completely outnumbered as usual. This is just not fair.
That's all right. You had your systematician on before.
I did have my systematician on before, so we're doing all right. Well, tonight, Professor Leppin, we wanted to ask you about Martin Luther's text, "Whether One May Flee from a Deadly Plague."
Yes.
And in relation to COVID-19, and if you think Luther might have any insights for us now as we seek to do theology today. So I'm going to take the risk of asking the church historian to speak a little bit in a contemporary fashion, but maybe you'll forgive me later or fail my doctoral exams, one of the two.
I'll try to do so. So to take a modern word, Luther does not really speak about social distancing by words. Mm-hmm. But he speaks a little bit about the fact of social distancing. So in this treatise, he speaks about people who are not severely ill, and he urges them not to go among other people, to not infect them by their own. So that sounds a little bit like the rules of social distancing.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, it's quite interesting to read him against the background of a time when all churches worldwide are closed.
Mm-hmm.
Because with churches being closed, the question for us is again, what does it mean for us as preachers, as pastors, to be present with the people who are ill or who are threatened by COVID-19?
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what Luther says. You have to be present. You, as a pastor, you as a preacher, you are not allowed to flee. He accepts all people saying, I'm afraid of being infected by the plague. But he says, those ones who have a duty, they have to stay there and they have to do their job. That's what we have to do now.
Mm-hmm.
Would Luther have presumed then that Christians were still gathering to celebrate worship?
I think he did, yes. He doesn't say anything about keeping the services. He actually says people should do penance, which means come quite closely to your pastor, and they have to go to the Lord's Supper, which also means there is a service in Wittenberg. Mm-hmm. And he even had classrooms in Wittenberg. He had no chance, unfortunately, to do it digitally. So they really had disputations.
Yeah, this is one of the fascinating things is the change in technology since then, our ability to minister to one another over things like Skype. For us, example, to have this kind of conversation would not have been an option for them.
I think it would have been. indeed they would have been, because Luther was quite aware of the fact you should be careful against your neighbor. That's your duty as a Christian, not to do anything to make him or her ill. If not, there would be another question of your spiritual salvation. So what he says is the most threatening thing is the spiritual plague. We need some spiritual advices, but he doesn't reflect about the question if this could be personally or digitally.
Right. That sort of gets into the fifth commandment in the small catechism. What we're doing now is to not endanger nor harm the lives of our neighbors.
Exactly. And this is written just 3 years after this treatise about not to flee the plague. So he has this in background, and he felt what it meant to be threatened by the plague. In the year 1527, when he wrote this treatise, his wife, Katharina, was pregnant with Elizabeth. In the last weeks, they were afraid of getting the plague when she still was pregnant there.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. That's crazy.
It is, yes. And so he had it really strong in his heart. And some people interpreting this treatise even say, you see, in the first lines, he spoke theoretically. Then he experienced the plague coming to Wittenberg. And in his manuscript, you can see he writes faster and with some will to say something about this situation he felt himself.
Have you seen this manuscript? Did you go to Wittenberg and look at it?
If I'm right, it is in Paris, indeed. I'm not sure, but however, I didn't read it. I didn't see it. It is printed in the Weimar edition of Luther's work, together with the print.
Okay. I have to check that then. And I'll send you a photo.
Okay.
That we can put up for everyone to see what the original might have looked like.
Absolutely. It's fascinating to think about the idea of this being of some great urgency to him to write this and to get this out. And I totally understand that. I myself have a correspondence with a prisoner that I use my typewriter for, and you can tell when I get really into it and when I'm like trying to get the words out as fast as I can because more typos appear, more jams in the typewriter appear.
Yeah. Yes.
And so then
I am on the phone. Well,
I think
you'll have to wait.
Yes, we're pausing.
Oh, yes?
Sorry, my child was yelling at me.
Oh, okay. That's always a risk. So then you are of the opinion that Luther would indeed favor this notion of social distancing.
I would think so, yes. Because his argument is you have to see Jesus Christ in your neighbor. He argues with Matthew 25, indeed, with the story of the great judgment, the last judgment, when Jesus says, whatever you have done to my little brother, you have done to me. And that's what Luther says. In this brother or sister, I see Jesus Christ himself. It's indeed an argument we know from the Middle Ages as an argument by works. So being saved by works, that's not actually what Luther says, but he picks up the biblical background of it.
Speaking of the Middle Ages, can you speak a little bit about what the plague would have been like in that era? That's something, given that I'm not a church historian, I just don't have the knowledge of what that would have been like at that time in terms of how we might situate this text of Luther before we apply it to our situation today.
There's there are different approaches to the plague, even in the Middle Ages. On the one hand, you know all those numbers of incredibly many people dying by the plague in the 14th century. One speaks about a third of the population of Europe dying with the plague. That's on the one hand, and people were always threatened by the plague. They started thinking about what death would mean to them. You know the kind of artis moriendi, the art of dying, written in the late Middle Ages. This came from the background of the plague going around Europe. On the other hand, even in the Middle Ages, you see people even making jokes around the suffering under the plague. So if you look into the famous work Decamerone of Giovanni Boccaccio, which was written in the midst of the 14th century, there you have the situation that the plague goes through Florence, and he describes the dead people lying in the streets of Florence. But 10 young people go out of Florence, in a village quite near to Florence, and start telling them nice stories, 10 stories each day about sex and crime and priests, which always fits very well together. And so I have a very humorous book written with the background of the plague.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it is not absolutely like we would think all people suffered or all people were full of fear about the plague. It was like we see in our times. There are some people quite far away of what happens now in the hospitals and living their life as usually as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. You see that now too with all of the sort of memes and jokes people make about it on the internet. Yes. And there's like this human need to laugh about our situation.
And the memes are really good sometimes.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
My favorite so far has been surrounding digital communion. It's Jesus at the Last Supper, and he's alone, and the disciples are in the above frame, and it says, "Judas, you on?" I get far too much amusement out of that. That's the next thing we wanted to ask you about tonight, by the way, Professor Leppin, is you do not favor the practice of digital communion, and you have written an article about this, which is in German. Sadly, we need to get that translated into English, I think, so that...
Yes, do so.
I don't have time. I'm working on a dissertation. Supposedly. So that American Lutherans can read it. But I wondered, because we've spoken with many guests on this show about this topic of digital Lord's Supper, because it's such a pressing matter right now of how to respond contextually in ministry situations. So I wonder if you might tell us why, actually, as a historian, as a theologian, and as an ordained pastor of the Lutheran Church, why you do not favor digital communion.
Mm-hmm.
I think I really have to stick on Luther in this point. And first of all, I'm not sure if all those people practicing digitalized Lord's Supper at the moment really think in the terms Luther did. My feeling is more people are looking for kind of communion, of being together somehow, and that's what many people think is the main thing in practicing, in celebrating the Lord's Supper.
Mm-hmm.
But for Luther, indeed, the main thing was, with bread and with the wine, you have the body and the blood of Jesus Christ himself. And this means it is exactly that bread the pastor speaks the words about. You cannot have a word which is very direct, going to an object like this, exactly this is my body, and then have something in the digital world which cannot be meant by the word this. If you say this, it is exactly one thing you speak about, and you can show it, as Luther said. You cannot show what is behind the digital world. So that I would say, in the sense of Martin Luther, we should be very, very hesitant against the digital Lord's Supper and should look for many, many other possibilities digitalized. I like all those digitalized services, but I don't think the Lord's Supper is the object to use it in the digital world.
That's fascinating. I'd never thought of the importance of the monstrance.
The monstrance?
The moment where you hold up and say, this is...
Yeah. Monstrance sounded a little bit like Catholic objects.
Yeah, that's the... Yeah. I use the term because I come from an Episcopalian background, and so that's the word I have.
Yeah, I would say it's the elevation.
Yeah, the elevation. Thank you. Yes,
the liturgical moment. Yes, but let's say indeed it's this moment showing it is exactly this object.
So my question would be, not, by the way, my own favoring of this in the highly contextualized circumstances has nothing to do with the notion of being in communion with people. I think that's just Zwingli redivivus, if I may. And I think Lutherans would do well to understand the position we articulate when we say things like that, which is not the Lutheran position. It doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong, but it's not the Lutheran position. My question would be, but it would admittedly be modifying a little bit what Luther himself would have thought. If you say, this is my body, and you've got elements right there in front of you, and it's a live-streamed service, my question would then be, don't you still have that proclaimed word visible in the elements in front of you?
You mean you are the one sitting with a view on a pastor saying those words? So you're not... It is not... I think this is just the receiver who can say, all right, this exactly is the bread, but not the person speaking those words. Because the pastor speaking those words, putting them into the digitalized room, the space, he does not know whatever there is. Is it something like bread, or does he also speak the same words about some crisps lying around? He doesn't know. And so to have an act of speech, do you say this in English? We say Sprechakt in German. It's act of speech, act of language.
Something like that. Speech act, maybe. Yeah.
Speech act. Oh, yes. Thank you. If you have a speech act, you really need to have the strong combination between speaker and the object he or her is speaking about.
Yeah. So this all gets back into what I've talked about before, the issue of, Brach, you've heard this before. This is probably new for you, Professor Leppin, because I came up with it in seminary. The nuclear Jesus hand grenade, which is what is the radius of the blessing of the sacrament, what of the blessing of the elements, and how long does it last? Which of course was seminary students love to debate these kinds of things, right?
Yeah.
And so that was the term I came up for it, and it really is interesting how much of it comes down to, how. I like the way you talk about it. The way you talk about it makes more sense to me than the way I heard other people who are opposed to digital communion talk about it. The act of the language and the things like that. You're not getting into. You in great deal avoid the nuclear Jesus hand grenade argument by.
That was the title of our first podcast episode, just for the record.
It was the title of our first podcast
ago, the
episode.
Nuclear Jesus hand grenade. And I thought, oh my Lord, what am I getting myself into?
But by talking about the language and this is, not that is. And I think that's really interesting and worth considering. Because we are declaring that is whatever you're holding is. We're declaring that this is my
and
body.
At the end, for myself, it is important not just to say no. It's not a nice role to say you are not allowed to do digitalized Lord's Supper. So what I'm proposing is saying enjoy what is called the agape in the New Testament. So enjoy breaking the bread as the first Christians did according to the Acts.
Right.
Do this. You can do this, and Jesus Christ is present in his spirit.
Yeah.
But he's not present in the bread.
Right. The Methodists call it the love feast.
Yes, that's exactly what I mean. And I think we should have done this. Now, Easter is over, so and Morning Thursday is over, so things are done somehow. Mm-hmm. But I would have preferred this kind of celebration.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, my beloved Dr. Father, Jürgen Maltman, would say you're not talking about anything different, between a love feast really and the Lord's Supper.
I appreciate Jürgen Maltman very much. I do, but I would not agree at this point.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's different, and it is different. If you look on the New Testament ground, Paul is making a difference in 1 Corinthians when he says we should distinguish between a meal where all people come together and a very special liturgical meal with the words of institution.
Mm-hmm.
That's the point where this love feast turns not really to a sacrament in the first century, but goes on the way to become a sacrament.
Mm-hmm.
Of course. Now my question, I think, are you familiar with the New Testament scholar John Dominic Crossan?
Yeah.
My suspicion is that Dom Crossan would say that there was no difference historically between the love feasts and the Lord's Supper. I don't know that for sure.
Yeah, I should. I had to look into what he wrote about that. I am myself a student of Gerd Theissen, and so somehow of Wayne Meeks, who was one of the favorite authors for Gerd Theissen. And there you have very clear interpretations of what happened in Corinth with Paul making a liturgical meal just to make the point that the difference between poor and rich people, which was shown in breaking the bread together, when people brought the bread with them, and rich people had much bread and poor people had just some slices of it. Paul intentionally made a difference and said that as Christians, we are brethren and sisters, and we have our own liturgical meal where you don't see who is rich and who is poor.
Right, where we all share the same bread and the same wine.
We do, yeah.
But that to me, when you say we all share the same bread and the same wine, that to me is what people like Maltman and Crossan are getting at. That in the first century, Eucharists were full-on meals. It's not a wafer and a sip of wine like we do in Württemberg, right? It's a full-on meal for a Eucharist.
Yeah, liturgically, I also would prefer the large cup for the supper to show it is one wine we share. But would Jürgen Moltmann really say within and around and under this bread there's the body of Jesus Christ?
Well, that I'm not sure. I mean, that would be a question of how indebted he is to his own Reformed theological formation. And so I suspect what also in these debates again comes through is the difference between a Lutheran formation and a Reformed formation.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, listeners, I am truly in hell because I have a main supervisor who is Lutheran and a secondary supervisor who is Reformed and a third examiner who is Methodist. So I have no identity. Sorry, I thought I knocked something over. But yeah, so I think these theological differences would, in fact, impact how we read it. I'm sympathetic, actually, to the Lutheran notion that this is a difference from an agape feast. I didn't ever hear of agape feasts until I was around Presbyterians, believe it or not. And
I really would add even the Leuenberg Declaration of 1973 between Reformed and Lutheran churches in Europe stresses the combination of the presence of Jesus Christ with the elements. So even Reformed churches should not take it too easy to have digitalized supper. But it's easy for me. I'm a Lutheran, so it's a bit clearer. But I think there's also a tradition in Reformed theology to stress at least the with the bread.
Yeah.
Jesus Christ is given.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Maltman has told me that he agrees with the Leuenberg Agreement. Of course, he was on the committee that formulated the Leuenberg Agreement. So I
you should agree, yes.
I would hope now. And he also told me, by the way, that Karl Barth would be very satisfied with the Leuenberg Agreement.
I'm afraid Luther would not be satisfied, but I'm not sure about it. I am happy with it.
But I wanted to press just a minute that Karl Barth would be satisfied with this as a Reformed theologian. That I found very interesting.
Yes, it was a declaration of Reformed and Lutheran theologians, and to me it means both sides can accept each other's side under certain circumstances and with certain formulas. As far as I understand Luther, he was not prepared to accept any other interpretation of the Lord's Supper than his own. As you said before, I mean Lutheran, what doesn't mean it is true. I just want to say it is Lutheran. This would not be the position of Luther, but he would say what is Lutheran is true.
Yeah. But what about the Wittenberg Concord between Luther, Melanchthon, Butzer, and somebody else whose name I'm forgetting?
Even in this text, he just said Butzer presents his doctrine of the Lord's Supper, and Butzer had to work on this text to be accepted somehow, which means Butzer had to formulate it in a way that Luther could understand what he said in the sense of what he himself meant. And even then he was hesitant to say we fully, but I at least accept what you say, because you say somehow Jesus Christ is present there independent of our faith or unbelief.
But in that sense, I think Luther would be satisfied with the Leuenberg Agreement then.
The Leuenberg Agreement has more the kind of, and I'm happy about this, but it has more the kind of to say what we can say in common is the following. While Wittenberg does not say what we say in common, but all right, the Strasbourg theologians say something, and with some difficulties in my stomach, I, Martin Luther, can accept it.
Yeah, it's funny. The deeper I get into Luther himself, I'm not sure I like him.
Actually, I don't think I like him, but he was right in many points.
Wait, you don't like him, but you specialize in him.
Yes, I find him fascinating and interesting. but he was so confident to be right in all time against Erasmus, against Zwingli, sometimes against Melanchthon. There were many situations where he was not prepared to ask the other side, what do you think about, and could we discuss it? But he just said, I'm right. You have to accept. And that's not the way I like doing theology. While Erasmus, Melanchthon, Zwingli are far more prepared to discuss with you.
Oh, but please
I
don't
know
tell
you
me
don't
Zwingli
like
was
Zwingli and
right.
Erasmus.
I may or may not have groaned about Erasmus in his lecture last fall. It just kind of happened.
So.
It was on the free will and the Holy Spirit, and I just I had a little groan there. I thought it was quiet. Apparently, it wasn't.
It was. The teacher heard it, please.
Well, I mean, Luther. So Eric Gritsch makes an argument in his book, Martin God's Court Jester, Luther in Retrospect, that Martin Luther was actually an ecumenist. But my sense is, from what you're saying, that you would disagree with Gritsch's claim.
I would disagree, yes. I don't see any ecumenical efforts in Martin Luther. I am myself tried to bring Lutheran thinking into the ecumenical dialogue. Nowadays, we have strong connections, say, in a dialogue with the Roman Catholic Church, and this is quite important. But I think this is the point where I disagree with Luther himself, and I can do so.
So then, as we are spiritual inheritors, if we might say, of the Reformation, how do you think it is best to appropriate Luther for contemporary theology, or does Luther primarily need to stay in the 16th century?
I would make a difference if I say Luther says, Luther thinks, or something like this. I should speak about Luther of the 16th century. And then there's a second hermeneutic step where I can say, I deal with Luther's ideas and I follow them up, I transform them, I accept them, I disagree with him. There's an obvious case where I hope all Lutherans would disagree in his writings about the Jews.
Right.
All of us should disagree with him. We have to if we are followers of Jesus Christ. So this is a way to deal with Luther, to know he was anti-Judaist in the 16th century, and as a Lutheran, better understanding what Lutheran theology should think, I have to find a way of dealing with Jewish-Christian dialogue nowadays.
So it almost sounds like that you're arguing for both a historical contextualization and a systematic appropriation.
I do so, yes. I can appropriate him whenever I know who he might have been in the 16th century. For sure, we do not know exactly, but we should do all historical efforts to know who he was and what he thought. Then we have a figure to deal with. As long as we don't do this, and as long as we do not know who Luther really was, there is a danger just to use him for our purposes. What they say. And as a theologian in Germany, I have very often heard the argument, Luther says, and with this sentence, whatever followed after Luther says, all discussion was finished.
Right.
And that's not the way to deal with Luther.
Right. There can be a tendency to turn the Book of Concord into a Third Testament.
Yeah. It could be, yes.
So you're talking about then and by the way, listeners, I'm taking great tips from my dissertation, but this is a conversation that you and I have been having for about a year now, isn't it?
It is, yes.
in other words, for me at least, how does a systematic theologian read Luther? But
Carefully.
You're arguing, it seems to me, for what I might term a responsible reading of Luther. And I'm reminded quite strongly of Heiko Obermann's biography of Luther and your own biography of Luther, which is to first put him as a late Middle Ages monk, and to work out from there and to realize how alien he is to our time. First.
Exactly, yeah. That's what I should do with every theologian.
Mm-hmm.
It's a kind of being honest with those persons. If anyone speaks about me in 500 years, I don't think anyone will do. But if anyone did so, I would hope he or her speaks about who I am and not just about what she or he figures out and thinks about having some scheme of Volker Leppin.
Yes, but is Volker Leppin really going to care? You're going to be safe in the arms of Jesus anyway.
That's right. Thank you for that, not for putting me into hell. So,
that'll only come if you fail me on the dissertation.
If I had the chance to watch what happens on Earth, I think even in heaven it would make me happier to see they really have an image of myself. If they speak about me, if they don't speak about me, I don't care. But if they speak about me, they should really think about me and not just use my name.
Mm-hmm.
But the other danger of this might be that the theological task stops. In other words, the theological task becomes only historical reconstruction. And there's no contemporary application at all. That would be the other extreme of it, right?
Yes, and I wouldn't recommend this way.
Yeah, but
you have to deal with this historical Luther. You have to deal with him, sure.
I think you can't actually bring something into the modern understanding without a historical reconstruction, without understanding it in the context. If nothing else, because language changes and because our understanding of meanings of words and phrases and things like that changes. You know, for example, if someone were to study, casual conversations from the 80s, they would think that there was a lot of evil floating around because everything was wicked.
That's right, yes.
Oh, that's right, because there was that phrase wicked or whatever.
Yeah, wicked, meaning cool.
Yeah. No, I see what you mean, and certainly there are some irresponsible readings of Luther's theology. We won't list them here because we don't want to do any sort of public slander. But so for you then, as a church historian, who would you say has a responsible contemporary reading of Luther?
You see, it's not easy to find an answer, but actually, I would say there are two persons who do this. I have in mind. It's Timothy Wengert and Bob Cole. Mm-hmm. Both Lutherans in Northern America in different churches, as you know. Mm-hmm. Both have a very strong historical basis, and both try to adapt this historical basis to their contemporary Lutheran theology and churches. Mm-hmm. They do a very good job. And in Germany, I would say Oswald Bayer is one who does so, who really looks for what you call the alien Martin Luther. Mm-hmm. He looks for him, and somehow he struggles with him. What I really appreciate, one sees, I think he also has at least parts of Luther he does not like. But he asks Luther, what do you mean? And what do you want to say? And then he adapts what he finds out from Luther to contemporary theology.
Mm-hmm. So you might then disagree with Jürgen Moltmann's book, The Crucified God.
Not with the book as a whole, just with some parts dealing with historical stuff.
Thank you for not disagreeing with the book as a whole, since it's my favorite theological book. I feel better now. So you mean the parts in there, for instance, where he says theology must return to Luther's saying "crux probat omnia"?
I think one should at least look if what he means with Luther here is really what Luther historically was.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is a great question relating to Luther as a theologian of the cross, and how much that actually defines Luther's output. Peter, we've been having discussions about this on our podcast for a long time now. Professor Leppin and I have been talking about this for a year, and I think you and I might have a difference on this, how much the Theologia Crucis is foundational to Luther.
I think at least we have a difference in emphasizing it very much and in giving the starting point in where he really speaks about Theologia Crucis in Heidelberg, 1518. Mm-hmm. I see him based in a spirituality of the cross since his very early years. Mm-hmm. So that's my approach to Luther, to see his late medieval roots. If I just, for a moment, might come back to the question for fleeing the plague. Mm-hmm. Exactly the argument he used in 1527, you have to stay in the plague as a pastor, he used in 1516 as a monk. And there, in a letter to his friend Johannes Lang, he said, "My duty in this plague is to stay here." So there, as a late medieval theologian, he said exactly what he would say more than 10 years later as a theologian of Reformation. And that's what I also see in his theology of the cross. You have a spirituality of the cross, very deep-rooted in medieval spirituality, starting with Bernard of Clairvaux, going through the order of Augustinian, having John of Staupitz, having John of Pfalz, all those figures always sticking to the cross. And then you have a huge background for the Theologia Crucis in Heidelberg. If you take this background with you, I would say, all right, Luther's theology is formed by this, but not only by those 2 or 3 sentences in Heidelberg. Mm-hmm. And not only by a doctrine, but by a lived faith.
And you know that systematicians like me love to take those 2 or 3 sentences from Heidelberg and make an entire theology out of them.
I know. That's why I say exactly this. And the listeners get a feeling of how I have to torture you over times.
I'm just enjoying hearing some of my arguments come out of someone else's mouth.
Yeah. The interesting thing, my dear Dr. Father has said to me, we read the Bible for ourselves and we read Luther for ourselves. We are allowed both to read for ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you can do so. You can use everything for yourself, but I speak about scholarly theology. It is.
You're speaking about scholarly theology too.
But that makes a difference. If you can read the Bible for yourself, you are there as a believer, and every believer can read the Bible for his or her own, and should read the Bible for his or her own. And it is not my right as a professor for theology to say to any not so well educated person, what you read in the Bible is wrong. This is good for the. But as a theologian doing scholarship in theology, I have to say what is right and what not.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting.
Oh, this is an approach I very much took as a pastor when I was a pastor, I would get up into the pulpit and I would sort of say, you by necessity declare your own opinions, and you say your own understanding of the Bible and your own understanding of the passages and things like that. But in moments of individual pastoral care, I would never come out and say to someone, "No, you're wrong."
Right. Yeah,
I might say, "Have you considered this?"
Yes.
But I would never say, "No, you're wrong," because that would be bad pastoral care. Yeah. And because theologically as Lutherans, we believe that people can come to their own interpretations of the Bible.
Yes.
Even if they're wrong.
In pastoral care, I have to look if this gives a feeling of salvation for the people. If people read the Bible and Luther in a threatening or frightening way, then I should say that's wrong.
Right.
Like Staupitz said to Luther, what you think is not Jesus Christ, but it is some speculation. This might help for the people in pastoral care, but to discuss about any doctrine or something like this, I would agree with you. The situation of pastoral care is not the situation to this.
My question would be, why can't theology be a form of Seelsorge?
Theology as a scholarship cannot be, because there is another situation of communication. When
it's I do theology, it's a matter of audience then.
And audience would mean just one speaking to an audience. I really mean the communication with others. As a theologian at university, I have to learn from historians, from biologists, and all this. This makes another context than Seelsorge, than pastoral care.
But there was a time where theology and Seelsorge were much more closely linked, right?
And there was a time when it was even more divorced than I would do.
Really? When was the time when it was more divorced than you would do?
I would say in the late Middle Ages. The theologians at university, at most universities, would not care about pastoral care. There were some reform movements, for example, the so-called Vienna School around 1400. They said we have to think about what this means for pastoral care. But in Paris, at the same time, people discussed about questions of theory of language, which was not so useful for pastoral care situations.
Right. So for me, anyway, this brings to mind the difference between like Aquinas and the Jesuit movements of theology. Aquinas probably didn't care so much about pastoral care as he did about getting an accurate, systematic theology down, whereas the Jesuits were much more practical.
However, even Thomas Aquinas was more concerned with the pastoral care than later theologians in Paris would be.
Okay, wow.
He was a Dominican, and he wrote some for the brethren in the order.
Okay.
Well, interestingly, even Edward Schillebeeck's book on Jesus, it's because you mentioned a Dominican that made me think of Schillebeeck's. He says in there that he wants the book to be useful to, quote, the person on the street, unquote, and if it's not, it can be sold back at the nearest secondhand bookshop tomorrow. Then he proceeds to write 672 pages of dense academic theology, but, at least that was his goal.
I wouldn't make this a measure for good academic theology. I wouldn't do so.
What would you make the measure?
A measure for a sermon. If a preacher does not reach his or her congregation, he or she should resign immediately.
Right.
But a professor is free to say what is right or not. even if it is not immediately linked with pastoral situations.
Mm-hmm.
So I assume you would have then a sharp difference here with Karl Barth.
Your assumption seems to be slightly right.
So theology for you is not the scientific self-examination of the church's proclamation.
It is not. It is linked to the church because it comes from the doctrine of the church,
Mm-hmm.
and it reflects on the doctrines of the church and the history of the life of the church. But it is not a kind of self-explication.
And this was, so I'm sensing maybe two extremes. The one extreme is to be entirely academic, as these theologians in Paris that you're speaking about. And the other extreme is to stay so close to the church as Karl Barth did, that you risk, even though he himself was very widely read in other disciplines, you risk only talking about theology and only relating it to the church. You risk a kind of navel gazing.
And I might thank you for giving those extremes, because the rhetorical figure, always you say there's a left form, there's a right form, and I'm right in the middle of both, and that's the right thing.
And interesting, isn't it, how the church historian is the one who's right?
Yes, he is. As Luther was always.
Right?
As Luther was. But Luther, I would agree with theology as a form of Seelsorge, would he not?
He would.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Now, again, to be honest, it was part of his reform program to combine the lectures at university closer to the sermons than people were used to. If you read his early lectures or his lectures through his whole life and compare them with his sermons, you see how close it is together.
Mm-hmm.
Why, in a person like Thomas Aquinas, you might see some difference between his treatise for religious people, which means his treatise for his brethren, the order, and his Summa Theologiae.
Mm-hmm.
But if we're going to appropriate Luther today, mightn't we also appropriate his synthesis of theology and Seelsorge?
No, that's exactly the point where I would stress we should see and somehow accept the difference between us and Martin Luther.
Mm.
And now we do theology in the context which follows the time of Enlightenment, and which forms theology. I speak as a German theologian, forms theology as a part of university. And so we have to follow this idea of theology at the university. Ulrich Schleiermacher did a great job to integrate theology into modern university. We should be grateful for him at this point more than for Luther.
So again, we're getting into the issue of context. We're in a context now where those two things are not as easily synthesized as they used to be.
Well, it depends on where you're at, right? I mean, Peter and I come from the seminaries. You can preach in your lectures if you want to. Lord knows I had professors who did it.
Yeah, Paulson was notorious for it.
Oh my God!
Was, yeah.
Paulson preaches in his books.
Some German professors did this too, but it is not the good way at universities in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
When did that tradition end? Right, because this really, let's name the elephant in the room. For the 20th century, we are essentially talking about the Barthian tradition when we speak of the unification of theology and pastoral matters. It's Barth who brings that back into focus. It's his critique, one of his many critiques of the 19th century. It's another matter whether he was actually fair to the 19th century. But that is his one of his battle cries, and then his disciples follow in that way. But in Germany, has the Barthian movement basically died out?
It has, mainly it has, yes. We have now kind of Schleiermacher movement again in Germany. I think 15 to 20 years now. So Schleiermacher is the leading figure in German theology at the moment, I think. Which is not my leading figure. My leading figure, as you Brach know, is Wolfhard Pannenberg. I would appreciate to have him as a leading figure, but the mainstream says it's Schleiermacher.
And is there a sort of convergence in a way between Pannenberg and Schleiermacher?
I think the awareness of universal scholarship, both try to do so. Schleiermacher translated Plato just to show how important philosophy was. And Pannenberg tried to integrate natural sciences even in theology.
Yeah, this is all these various ways of doing theology are interesting. I didn't realize that I was somewhat of a Barthian until I met you, for instance. I still don't like that word, by the way. I wouldn't call myself a Barthian.
I myself like blaming you for this.
My what?
I myself like blaming you for being a Barthian, if you don't like the word.
Okay, if you say. It was just ironic because I never really read Barth until I started studying with Dr. Maltman, and he led me quite deeply into Barth. And then I decided more out of to see if I could do it than anything, which was to frame my dissertation in a directly Barthian framework, and to say, okay, I'm going to take this on. And but it's funny. I mean, I read Barth and I just find myself saying yes, yes, yes. Over and over and over again, and so it's. But I still wouldn't use the label of Barthian because I would find that restrictive and narrow, and I wouldn't want to, believe it or not, I wouldn't want to stick quite as closely to the church as Barth does. I would want to be more like Maltman than Barth, and Maltman breaks out of the scheme of the church dogmatics a bit, and he does in fact integrate natural sciences. He does directly integrate philosophy. Barth knew all of these intellectual traditions, but he didn't use them quite as directly in his work, whereas Maltman does. The new sort of literature and music and all of that, which Maltman also directly just puts everything in there. That's probably more the way I would go. I
hope I get a podcast of our talk today to remember you for what you just said.
Why? Because you expect me to integrate natural sciences into my work.
Yes. For example.
I really shouldn't say this publicly. I'm going to eat my words, but no. In the ideal sense, maybe not now in the doctorate because one has to zero in, but just in an overall approach, that would be why I would resist the label of Barthian, because I don't want to follow anybody so closely. I don't care where the good ideas come from, if it's Pannenberg, if it's Aquinas, if it's process theology, if it's queer thought. It doesn't matter to me so much as the good ideas, if that makes sense.
Let's wait how much Barth your second supervisor will find in your dissertation.
Yeah. And on that note, now that we have given our listeners, Peter, a little glimpse into my torture in Tübingen, we want to thank you so much, Professor Dr. Volker Leppin, Professor for Church History, Reformation and Middle Ages Focus, Dean of the Evangelical Theology Faculty at Tübingen, and my beloved secondary dissertation supervisor, for joining us tonight. This has been a very fruitful and interesting conversation. I know I have learned things. Peter, I hope you have as well.
Oh, absolutely.
And listeners, hope you have as well. Do listeners check out Professor Leppin's book in English, Martin Luther, A Late Medieval Life. Sadly, as so often happens when German texts get translated into English, it's a little bit abbreviated, which is a disappointment, but it is still excellent, and you can read it in a weekend, which I did last year. So, on that note, we'll sign off for now.
I'm Peter Clark.
For me.
Yes.
Good evening.
Yep.
Good evening. And I'm Brach Jennings, and this is your friendly neighborhood Lutheran theology podcast, Stumbling Block.
Stumbling Block is a production of Silver Turkey Studios. Our Patreon producer is Ben Dittman, our executive producer is Peter Clark, and our executive director is Brach Jennings. Our theme music is by Mirrors for Windows, and we are hosted by Podbean. We can be reached by email at stumblingblockpodcast@gmail.com. Please consider supporting us at patreon.com/stumblingblock. And as always, thank you for listening.